Good day, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Spark Your Fire. I'm your host, David Shih, as always, and here with me is John Comino, our co-host as well for the property segment. How are you doing, John?
Well, David, very well. How are you doing?
Good. I'm very good. I'm very good. Well, good news. Jazz has officially came back to the pod, although he's not joining us today.
Yippee.
Should have actually got him back, right? We need to do an official intro to our new co-host again. Who's
Oh,
the
that's
co-host?
awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. He brings some great perspectives, and he's got a really good view on a couple of alternative asset classes. He really understands crypto. He understands some other things, and he's obviously got a background in real estate. So he's missed, and
Oh, absolutely. Missed big time. And I'm sure, with him back on the show again, hosting different type of property, well, not property, non-property segments, talking about financial markets and shares and crypto and all that kind of stuff. And he'll be interviewing, the big names again, like Roger Montgomery, for example. So it will bring a lot of mix to this podcast again. So I think it's a great to have him back, that's for sure. But look, we are here back to do another property episode, just because everyone loves talking about property, right? Like it's basically the national sport of Australia. Let's put it that way, apart from footies, of course.
that's right.
Different thing.
Apart from actual sports, yeah.
Yeah, actual sport, but this is a national sport that we're talking about here. And for today, I think of a very interesting topic that we can cover off on, which is the best and the worst property advice that you've ever received. So one of those things that I think, as you and I help a lot of clients every day and help a lot of people. And, we certainly at some point in time in our investing journey would have got advice from various different people as well. So, it's one of those that we cast our mind back in terms of all the advice that we receive throughout journey and pick out kind of the worst and the best that we thought to share with our listeners today. What do you reckon, John?
Oh, it's a great idea. And look, it's just worth emphasizing. This is just advice that we've received. It's not advice that we're giving, but wisdom is wisdom, and take it as you wish.
That's true. That's true. Again, a good advice is tailored and is specific to individual circumstances. So yes, I guess what we're trying to do, it's general advice here that we're giving as always. But for, the other way to look at it is two property investors having a bit of a chat, sharing their own experiences. That's the best way to look at it. All right. Cool. All right. Shall we start with best advice then, John?
Let's do it.
Okay. All right. I'll start with mine. I've actually got a couple best advice as a matter of fact, but I'm sure most our listeners who tune into this podcast won't be too unfamiliar with the ones that I'm about to quote. The first one came out from the sales agent who sold me the off the plan property, by the way. So it's kind of ironic to that degree. But I classify it as the best advice because he told me back in about 2009 that people will always make money out of those people who came into the market late. So in other words, those people who bought property early will always make money out of those who bought late, okay, in the game. And I thought at that point in time, it was interesting because, okay, well, why is that always the case? Because there's a bit of assumption to say the property value will continue to go up to that degree, right? Like I was obviously a newbie at that time, so I have no idea why that was the case. But that, I mean, we spoke about a lot at that point in time as part of, obviously you want to make the transaction happen, but that was the key thing that popped in my head. Which I can still remember even after 10 plus years. That was still the quote that I can still remember. And I think now that seeing where, got the knowledge what I have, knowing what I know, that's absolutely true. That is absolutely true. And John, what do you think about this quote?
I like it. I think for me, there are three parts. One is what he is saying explicitly, and then there's what is sort of implied by what he's saying. And I think the explicit thing he's saying is start young, because the more later people there are, the more people you can make money off in that sense. So start young. I think that's when you think of inflation as a cumulative phenomenon in the economy, but we'll come back to that. That means that's always true. And in fact, the earlier you start, the earlier your returns go exponential.
Yes.
So Absolutely. I love that. So yeah, yes, start early. Now, moving on to what's implied by the comment, it sort of implies there's a bit of a greater fool aspect in real estate investing, which I don't know if he's trying to say that, but it almost implies that everyone who comes after you is overpaying. I don't know if that's necessarily true because inflation does its thing, but in some markets that is true, that you rely on the greater fool. And then finally, what I think the statement does well is it, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but it recognizes inflation as a permanent feature in the economy and as a cumulative economic phenomenon.
That's right.
So yeah, start early. I love
think you summarized pretty much. We should probably call it a wrap now, John.
Not at all, not at all. Yeah, it's really spot on. Like that is the best advice is start early.
Start early.
I've
Absolutely.
got nephews and they're about 21, 22. They're just getting into the workforce. I'm like, when are you buying a property? You got to start now. Like the advantage you will get with girls and in terms of wealth is stunning if you start as early as you can. Ignore the girls bit, but economically.
By the way, John, I just found out. I thought you can't buy a property in Australia until you're 18, but apparently that's not the case. You can. You can actually buy a property, assuming obviously you can take on a mortgage, etc., right? But I think on the title or on the mortgage itself, on the title itself, it'll show that it'll have a bracket to say minor. In other words, you are under 18.
Okay.
Anyway, that's just an interesting aside that I found out the other day. But yeah, definitely start early in that sense. And also to echo one of your earlier points, does the people who came in late always pay a bit more premium? Depends. It depends.
Yeah.
Yes, whilst this advice that point in general would work, but I have seen in the past, let's use Perth as an example. Perth has been down for 10 years, basically. Before this latest run, let's say, for example, you bought something during the mining boom at a peak price, and then you got in 5 years later, which actually it might have declined or even stagnant for that period of time. So does that mean that someone coming late always have to pay a premium and the earlier ones always made money? Not necessarily.
Yep.
So yeah, but in general, because of, like you accurately pointed out, because of the inflation game that we're playing, hence the reason why that property value go up and up and up.
Let's come back to that because that's the heart of the matter, I think.
Spot on. Right. All right, John, how about you? Do you want to share your next one?
Yeah, so I've got two. My first one's really easy. We can say it and then I'll ping pong it back to you. So I remember my dad was an accountant. I remember, public practice, kind of working on the edge of a basin sink. And I remember asking him really when I was a teenager, and I said, what do all of your wealthy clients have in common? And he said, well, they all got into real estate. Like all of them, all wealthy people in real estate. And I remember that stuck with me for ages, and I sort of put that in the back pocket. And when I became of age, I started looking at that more seriously. But I feel like that's basically right. Wealthy people are owners; they're not consumers, in a sense. Because if you're not an owner, you're a consumer. And I think that that is, and property is the ultimate form of ownership in some respects. So, yeah.
One form of
people
asset,
in property.
I should put it that way. Property is definitely one form of asset in terms of the ownership. You can also own shares. You can also own cryptocurrency, anything else than that. But your dad, being obviously a very wise accountant, would have given you that kind of advice to say, look, there's a common thing that rich people always seem to be parking money into property. There must be something with that. So you may not have understood it fully why at that point in time, at that tender age. But now that in terms of where you are looking back, you probably would have understand why a lot better now. Essentially seeing how the wealthy people manipulate and play around the money game.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. No, great advice there, mate. I've got to say, you got a really good dad. You obviously follow his
path. Thank you very much. He's still alive too. He's still alive.
Bit of an accountant too. I think there's always that accountant.
Well, that's right. I became an accountant too. So
exactly. Follow his path. So. All right, my next one. Okay, this is again sound like a bit of a cliche. The best time to buy property is yesterday, and the next best time to buy is today. So I started sounding like a buyer's agent, got to say, John.
I know. Be careful. Be careful who you listen to. Yeah, no, it's good advice. Good advice. It's a cliche, isn't it? Like the best time to buy was 20 years ago or yesterday or whatever, and the next best time to buy is today. But it's true. You know, I did a presentation the other day where I pulled up a chart of house prices since 1979 to 2024, right? So really current stuff. And it shows property prices going up. Now, since 2008, it gets a bit volatile, but it still goes up.
Yes.
And I think there's a temptation to view this this mentality that property always goes up. There's a temptation to view that as unsophisticated, like, oh, well, it doesn't always go up, you know. But, you know, it basically does. It basically does. So because you can't time how old you are 20 years ago, all you can do is buy today. And then one day your purchase will be 20 years ago and you can talk about how clever you were.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, I think if you ask a experienced property investor in terms of their biggest regrets, they will always tell you, I haven't gone hard enough at the time as well, right? I should have, knowing what I know today, would have gone harder, at least 2 times harder, try to accumulate twice as much in terms of the portfolio as well. So, you know, I think that kind of echoes in terms of the best time to buy is actually yesterday. And again, you know, there's the explicit part and the implicit part again. I think with obviously the explicit part is very clear, but the implicit part again touches on the inflation aspects of things as well. But also, I remember this also ties in with John, what you've been saying. We're very limited in terms of the working life that we have.
Yes.
So, you know, the bank's not going to lend you when you're getting towards your retirement age. So you got very, very limited time. So there's only a golden time frame that you can secure funding for this to play this property investment game. Make use of it wisely, basically. And
yeah, that's right. That's right. Maybe, you know, there might be a property market crash in 2035, but I'll be nearly 60 then. So I'm not, I mean, that's no good for me. So all I can do is buy today.
yes.
And you can't control the market. All you can do is control how attractive you are to the bank and how attractive you are to the bank right now. So I agree. All you've got is the present tense in that sense. And there will be crashes and you can't do anything about that. So you can just buy today.
There will be ups and downs, basically, throughout this journey, like everything in life, basically.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, I'll circle back to you, John.
So my other piece of advice. So when I bought my first property was in 2006. So I was in my 20s. I'm in my late 40s now. And I bought my first property with LMI, Lenders Mortgage Insurance.
Yep.
And at the time, it was like a huge risk, and not having a big enough deposit implied that I hadn't saved enough. It also implied that I was biting off more than I could chew and that the property was too expensive. But someone told me at the time, go all in, because no one regrets, sort of like your last point, no one regrets buying too much property. And so I get the lender's mortgage insurance because I only had a 10% deposit. And, but, you know, not being afraid of lender's mortgage insurance, which was the right thing for me back in 2006, and it's not advice, but for me, that was the best advice I got, because the bigger the acquisition meant the bigger the gains. And if you accumulate that over 20 years, it was a great outcome. So yeah, not to be afraid of LMI and to go all in early was good advice.
And that's definitely a very important piece, because a lot of people perceive LMI as being the devil, right? Like fundamentally what LMI is, it's actually insurance to cover the bank. It's not even covering the borrowers, yet the borrowers have to actually fork out that fund to pay for it. So a lot of people will be asking, why am I paying to cover the banks, right? In terms of defaults, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not doing that. I'm not paying for the bank. They're already making a lot of money out of me. So there is, unfortunately, a lot of misconception in terms of the lender mortgage insurance, in terms of how it's being perceived. But at the same time, I think, like everything, there's a lot of perspectives in terms of how you look at it. If you're buying a property as an owner-occupier, then lender mortgage insurance, unfortunately, may not be that good. It's a necessary evil, basically, because, unfortunately, you don't have enough deposit. Fair enough. if you're an investor, however, that LMI can be added onto a loan. In other words, capitalized onto the loan, and you pay that off as part of the overall long term, and that's all tax deductible as well. So it's not necessarily all that bad when you look at it from an investment perspective. And this is a property podcast for investors primarily, right? So
yes,
ultimately, I think a lot of times property investors need to switch their perspective a little bit. The LMI is again a cost of doing business. And what LMI could be is by taking on that, it could allow you to be able to acquire 2 properties instead of 1.
Yes, that's right.
It could
That's
allow
right.
you to do that, which means you'll have 2 properties that's working very hard for you in the next 20 years. It's growth, right?
As long as you can service it, of course. Right?
Correct. As long as you can service it as well. So, so that is to me, LMI is an enabler.
Yeah.
It's an enabler, okay, to help. And it gives people options, because if it's not even available, the lender's not even going to lend you more than 80%. Then you're stuck. You always have to come up with 20%. And we all know how difficult it is right now to actually save a 20% deposit, given the cost of rising inflation and everything, right? So, so great point, John. I think, you obviously made the right choice back at that point in time to get the better property by taking on the LMI. And look, 20 years down the track, you look back and go, that's one of the best decisions.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Look, I just want to pick up on something you said, which I think was spot on. You're insuring the bank for a risk that might impact them. And it's easy to get resentful about that. But when you think about it, like, let's say I buy a unit in Neutral Bay. What's the risk? Well, I'm the risk. The unit's not the risk. The unit will be fine. The unit will be there well after I'm gone. The unit's fine. The risk is me. And from that perspective, it's not totally unreasonable that I, as the risk that's being introduced into that equation, pays for the insurance.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
There you go. That's so go forth if that's right for you. It was certainly right for me. LMI is not always the worst thing.
It's not correct. It's not the end of the world to be paying some LMI a lot of times,
That's right.
and I can tell you a lot of people make big big comments around those things.
Yeah.
No, okay. No, that's very good. Okay, my third one, in terms of the advice. Okay, so property, again, a lot of experienced investors probably would have heard this. Property is a game of finance and inflation.
Yep.
So I added the inflation part because I kind of combined a few advice together in that sense, but they all have fairly good similarities in that sense. And I think this one, we touched on inflation already. We can obviously extrapolate in this sense. Property is a game of inflation and a game of finance. So first of all, let's touch on the finance. That's quite simple to understand. If you're looking at buying a property, you need to basically be able to secure funding from a bank. We also touched on that a bit earlier. So how much funding you can get determines how far you can go and how many properties you can buy, or that in that sense, right? Because everyone is only limited in terms of their savings. So what we generally find, putting my mortgage broker hat on, is borrowing capacity generally greater than the amount of cash people have in their bank account. Okay, so game of finance comes down to how do you structure finance so that way you can try to go further by potentially borrowing a bit more from the bank and use less of your limiting resource. That's what it comes down to when I talk about property is a game of finance. The game of inflation, which I think, our listeners would have been very, very familiar with now by the time. They're probably so sick of hearing about it now, by the way. We are living in the economy that pretty much constantly has inflation as part of the system, right? So it's, it's the monetary policy is inflationary to that degree, in essence. So, and to use a very simple example, John, if I could ask you, maybe 10 years ago, how much is a bottle of Coke? It might be $2, right? And how much is a bottle of Coke today? $3.50, $4, that kind of stuff. So, that's a very good example of how inflation kicks in. Basically, the money only keeps losing value over time, unfortunately. That's what it comes down to. Money keeps losing value over time. So a lot of times when we look at property value, my property value doubled. Not necessarily. It's not because your property real value has doubled, but it's because the money has lost its value across that period.
That's right.
So, that advice to me was basically a game changer at that point. And that made me understand the whole game, why people want to borrow in order to play the game. Because at the end of the day, your loan amount, as long as you don't touch it and you keep paying down, that's only going to come down and losing value. So in other words, time is paying off your debt for you across. Yeah. So, and that was the main game changer. But I think I babble on long enough. So
no. It's so essential. It's so essential to understand it. Yes. So there's a saying: you can either have central banks or you can have the free market, but you can't have both. And we have central banking in our economy, which means we have these fractional reserve systems where money compounds off money, and we have this ever-growing currency supply. That's not what happens in a free market. In a free market, you don't have a central bank that can issue currency, really, or they can issue currency, but they can't introduce fractional reserve lending. Anyway, I'm babbling. Inflation is the key to understanding why real estate always goes up. And it's not that it goes up once. Inflation, as Elon Musk said in an interview recently with, I think, Joe Rogan, he said, they're asking, will prices come back down after the big inflation of the last couple of years? And he said, well, they won't come back down because inflation as a phenomenon is cumulative. So it might stop going up, but it will never come down. And so once you realize inflation is cumulative, and it changes everything. So understanding it is also the same as understanding why the government can run budget deficits literally for decades, because the central bank is there to print the money and lend it to them in this endless supply of currency. And this is how governments can always print GDP growth, which is what they want to do. So they issue money into the banking system lends it on, and this mandrake mechanism of infinite currency always leads to GDP growth, and they can get re-elected or whatever it is. So that's sinister. It's a sinister sort of interpretation. You don't need to go down that sinister path to know that there'll always be some mild inflation in the economy. That's always the currency supply expanding. And real estate's sort of at the, if you imagine like a fire hose where the water's coming out, real estate is really close to the fire hose because it gets the currency first. When the banks get the money, they lend it to real estate investors.
Yeah.
And it's a couple of years later that it ends up in consumer prices. So the reason real estate investors do so well is they're kind of getting all that freshly minted currency first, well before it ends up in consumer prices. So yeah, inflation's a cumulative phenomenon that definitely benefits real estate investors first.
And it also reminded me, when you say it's cumulative and it's probably never going to go back down, that reminded me with rents. Is the rent going to go back down after this inflation period? No, it's not. Once it starts coming up, then it's really, like you said, it's probably going to stagnate and it's going to stay as is, but we're not going to see rents going back down to where they used to.
That's right.
So it's all part of the overall game in a sense. Hence the reason why it's a game of inflation, right? So
it's a game. It's a game. You just know how to play it as well. You need to know how to play it, and yeah, I agree.
Very good. All right, so that's the best property advice that we've received. Shall we touch on a bit of a worse property advice just to turn it around?
Yeah. I'll give you my first. These will be quick. I'll give you both of mine because they're kind of related. But
okay.
No, I've only got one. The worst property advice I had was to wait. I mean, I bought property early, but I remember always thinking that there would be a property market crash around the corner. I was listening to lots of sort of doomsday American economic prognosticators saying that the economy is in a shambles and it's going to, the property market's going to crash. And this concept of waiting for this next correction was probably the worst advice I could have listened to. And it's what prevents people from doing what you said earlier, which is going all in and going in harder. Yeah. So what I've come to realize is the economy may be good, it may be bad. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything for real estate prices, actually. I mean, we're probably in a recession now. Property prices going up. When the property market, when the economy is doing well, the property market goes up, and when the economy is bad, the property market goes up. My point is, a broken clock is right twice a day, and if you're always predicting a recession, it'll just stop you from doing things. Yeah. So I don't really try to forecast recessions anymore, because there'll be one and I'll be wrong. So yeah, so this sort of like constantly sort of predicting recessions and waiting. That was the worst mindset I could have ever had.
No,
Yeah,
absolutely, mate. I think I would definitely agree that would classify as one of the worst advice that you could ever receive in regards to property is to
yeah,
wait. That 4-character word is probably the worst that you could ever
mm,
receive from anyone, in that sense. But it also reminded me, I think, you mentioned when you look at property, you also have to think of it. It's it's a home. People need somewhere to live.
yeah,
Apart from the fact you look at it from a property investment vehicle perspective, yes, it will give you some capital growth, but fundamentally, there's demand and supply because people always need a roof over their head.
yeah,
So,
yeah. That's
like you
right.
said,
How wrong can you go?
exactly.
Yeah,
Like, disregard whether the economy is good and bad, people still need somewhere to live at the end of the day.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
So,
right. Yeah,
yeah,
property as an investment is actually its secondary purpose. Its primary purpose is accommodation. The secondary
combination.
purpose is as an investment, and it's not even 50% of the homes owned are investment properties. It's more like 25 to 30%. So it is like a minority of the property landscape is for investors. Everyone else is just looking for a roof over their head.
True, true.
So yeah, I had something else to say, but I've lost it. So, but I agree. Yep.
All right. Okay. So in terms of mine, worst advice that I could receive, I guess my personal experience, and I'm quite grateful that I've had quite a lot of mentors along the way that's helping me, guiding me on the right path. But with my first purchase being off the plan, I gotta say that's probably the worst advice that I've ever received. Which to
Mm,
date, like you, John, I think you still hold one of the worst performing properties. That one, the off-plan apartment at Granville is still my worst performing property today.
right.
And I've been sold with all the shiny brochures. I've been
Mm,
talked into the depreciation that it could help me from a taxation perspective. I've been told the maintenance issues isn't going to be an issue. You don't need to worry about it like it's an old house.
yeah.
Buying off the plan is going to be the solution to your property investment journey is probably the worst advice that I've got from. Funny enough, the first sales agent that also sold me, who also gave me the advice about buying in early, he was going to
Yeah,
make
good
money
and
out of
bad
late.
advice from this guy. Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think unfortunately this comes down to a product thing. But yeah, that is yeah,
Mm,
that when I cast my mind back out of the property journeys, this is definitely one of the worst that I could classify as definitely top 3. So
yeah.
yeah, and hence one of the reasons why a lot of people coming to me asking about off the plan and that kind of stuff. I say try to run as far as you can, mate. To be
Yeah, yeah,
honest.
yeah. Yeah, no, it's good. You're right. It's sort of classic. It's really. I think it's well understood now. Buying off the plan. I don't think it was always quite so well understood. Actually, I think if you go back to 2005, what year did you buy your unit off the plan?
2009.
Okay, all right. So I think in the first decade of of this century, I don't think it was quite so well established that buying off the plan was a bad idea.
Mhm.
But
At that point in
but
time, I think it's quite common,
yeah,
especially
that's right.
with Asian demographics, to get
Right.
something in for that kind of stuff. And look, it has gone up, yes, absolutely, but it hasn't been performing that stellar in
Hmm.
comparison. And like there's a lot of obviously building issues and that kind of stuff that's now starting to rear its ugly head over 10 years. Stratas keep on going up every year and every year as well. So,
Right.
to
Right.
that degree, is it really the best performing asset? Not really. Should I
Mm,
get rid of it? Now I'm in a bit of a chicken and egg. If I sell that, I'm going to make a loss and all that stuff.
yeah.
So yeah, it's
Sometimes you just got to wear the mistakes. I've got a property that I wouldn't have bought if again, but we're just going to hold on to it, and it'll be fine.
Yeah.
I think that there might, I think sometimes, I mean, generally speaking, buying off the plan is bad, but if you were to buy off the plan in Point Piper for a unit with water views, that might be okay. I mean, there are probably
in Point
I have no insight here, and I don't even know if there's any such property, but there are probably exceptions to it. Like I imagine sort of unique properties, like the Barangaroo, you could probably make money out of that sort of stuff. But
True.
I think for most parts of Sydney, it's not going to work.
Exactly. So I think, again, it comes down to perspectives as well, yes, and also comes down to asset as well. But yeah, unfortunately, most people don't have the skill set to be able to identify the right asset to get in. So, which actually comes back to our initial point of discussion before we jump on the pod. We were talking about property is actually a difficult game to win. As a matter of fact, it's easy to get in, but it's actually very difficult to make good money out of it. So I reckon that would be a good topic for us to cover next time, John.
Yes, yeah, to be continued. It's a very difficult investment class to do well in. Yeah, that's right.
All right, well, we'll probably leave it at that then. But yeah, I thought that was something that just came to my mind. So let me ask you one last thing, John, before we wrap up.
All right.
And again, I want to see whether you believe this is a good or bad advice. You know how a lot of our parents during their generation, they buy their home, they pay it down before they look at anything else. So naturally speaking, they would tell their son and daughter, you should go out and buy a property, buy a home, live in there, pay it down as quickly as you can before you start thinking about investing. Now, is that good or bad advice in your opinion?
I think it depends on what you want to achieve. If you want to build a property portfolio, it's bad advice because you run out of time, so you'll never be able to do that.
Yep.
I'm broadly in favor of buying a property and trying to pay it off, particularly if you're living in it. But you'll at the end of 30 years you'll own one property that'll be worth more. But it's bad advice if you want magnified and cumulative wealth accumulation. So you need to buy multiple properties and you'll never do it with that strategy. So what I would suggest is you buy a property, you pay it down for a little bit, and then within a couple of years, you start to think about adding investment properties, but you can't wait too long.
Yep. Spot on. So again, I think, obviously the parents are trying to think of it from the best perspective for their kids. But the one thing to understand in today's environment, especially understanding the inflation keyword, your money keeps losing value with inflation kicking in. So, basically to me, those people who doesn't have an investment debt are the ones that's actually going to losing out in the current age. Back in our parents' generation, when money's still tied to gold, which is a complete different story at that point in time, that's definitely a good advice in that sense, I would say. But when, ever since they shifted and no longer they can now print infinite amount of currency, it's now becoming an inflationary game. So if you're not holding on to any good debt, and I emphasize good debt in this case, you're going to be the one that's going to be running out of, get paced out by other people in the current race. So
that's right. And our parents and grandparents often fled countries that mismanaged their currencies. In fact, almost all of us fled, are descendants of people who fled countries that it's not always fleeing war-torn countries. It's usually you're fleeing just basic mismanagement. So yes, that's why our parents and grandparents were very in favor of sort of Anglo-Saxon property because it is so reliable. I think it just comes down to perspectives and different times as well. So different advice works for different times, definitely. We'll leave it at that then. Anything else to add, John? Nothing to add. Good chat. Awesome.
All right, lovely. Well, thank you guys. Thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode. I think I'd like to make it more conversational. I think this is actually quite good, make it more interesting as well. Jazz will be running the next show, so I'm sure everyone will be looking forward to it. But again, we'll come back in probably about a month's time to chat about property again. So until then, stay safe, and we'll see you guys again. John and David.